we were talking about the things that could trigger a war like this. So I said the number one thing is an election issue. Because when you look at these kinds of wars, the thing that causes it is the one side asks another side for a concession and they refuse. And a nation is often like a marriage where there's a marriage between the right and the left. And in a good marriage, they call it the bird method, where if your spouse says, hey, look at that cute bird outside, and then the other person is interested in the bird, that's one of the best predictors for if you have a healthy marriage, because it signifies that the other person is willing to care about the little sacrifices of the other person. And we are way past this point in our marriage. And Ryan Long's got a really funny skit about if American politics was a marriage, and it just completely dysfunctional. And so one time that happens is elections, because that requires one side to hand over power to the other. The second time is with budget crises. And
oh yes, that's what we're talking about.
Budget. If an election wasn't in play, I would say it's a budget crisis. That's the top predictor. But there's an election that's so close, I think that nudges it out for the top result. So it took us 250 years to reach the amount of debt we had in 2014. We have doubled that debt since. And that's something where we have more debt than the entire total GDP of the country. And that's horrifying. And this is one of those things where it's just, this is one of those things that we really, really need to talk about as a society, but we don't. And it's in my mind, there are about 5 different things that we really need to talk about as a society, and we don't, and that they're going to kill us. The budget's one of them, where this is the era of the most money printing ever in history, and no one notices. And that's actually one of the biggest predictors of these kinds of crises, because once the government prints money like this, it means they're desperate. So election issue, budget issue. Third is foreign war. And so let's say if there's a war with Iran, and let's say the deep state wants young American men to fight for a war for Iran. That's not going to happen. We've ruined the patriotism. So a war like that is another great predictor. And then beyond that, it would be...
Well, the war with Iran, the Iran thing's interesting.
Yes.
Because it's really Israel and Iran. But we're getting dragged into... We're sending...
Yes.
Which I don't disagree with sending battleships.
Yes.
Because that's deterrence. However, it's interesting that they're not retaliating to any of these.
Yes.
The killing of the political leader of Hamas and I think he was a field commander of Hezbollah.
Yes.
In Lebanon. And either they're waiting for a strategic retaliation, could be 6 weeks, could be 6 years from now, or Russia and China went to them and said, hey, let's play it even keel. Let's be the sane ones here when Israel looks like the unhinged, maniacal fucking rocket people lobbing rockets into Iran. If you guys play it cool, then we can make the Western world look like psychos.
I put an 80% shot there's no war with Iran. I think it's high chance it doesn't happen. And the U.S.'s Middle Eastern foreign policy is probably something we shouldn't have. It's a remnant of when we were dependent on the Middle East's oil. And now the U.S. no longer is. We're one of the biggest oil exporters in the world. And so there's no real strategic reason to be involved in the Middle East. America, in my opinion, I used to be more interventionist. Now I'm pretty isolationist because I just don't think we can afford to do that with our internal issues. And it's... bureaucratic politics often get captured by weird special interest groups where the people who are involved in the Middle East, like the various defense contractors, the local governments, they all have a vested interest for America to stay in the Middle East at the expense of America as a country. And the way Iran works is that they are pretty desperate as a government. They're not in a good place, and their population hates Israel. So they get propaganda boosts by just hating on Israel and threatening war, but they're not actually incentivized to start a war because they're not. It's a lot of show to make the regime look strong, but I don't think they're actually in a place where it makes sense for them to do so because they're a very disliked regime. If they're arming young men to fight another country, they're really arming young men to rebel against their own government. And foreign war is number 3. Number 4 is Black Swan event. And a Black Swan event is another Nassim Taleb term for random historic event no one can predict. So COVID's a Black Swan. It just hit us. And I know authors who predicted that there's a very smart author who actually predicted that we would have a coronavirus pandemic in like over the 21st century. But
when was that published?
90s. It's Vaclav Smil.
And he said coronavirus?
Yes, he said that some kind of coronavirus, because he was looking at SARS. Or no, it can't be 1990s. It has to be early 2000s. He said there's a pretty high chance that SARS shows up in a new form, and that's what coronavirus was.
Yep.
And because if you look at history, if you want to look at a century, the bet that there will be a major war and a plague it's close to 100%. For each century, the chances that you won't have a major war or a major plague, they're very low. You shouldn't bet money on that. And so Black Swan, the events in Britain are fascinating, and they're really one of those domino things where in Britain you see a bunch of dominoes falling very quickly. How closely have you followed the British riots?
Not very closely.
Okay, they're one of the most interesting political events recently, and I'd recommend...
Can you break it down for me so I'm a little bit...
Yes, I was going to do that.
Okay, cool.
And if you guys are interested, you should watch my friends at the Lotus Eater podcast. They're basically the British Daily Wire. I don't know if that's an insult or a compliment. And so they have like a 7-part series on the British riots. And they do a great job of breaking it down. But so what happened is that, as I'm sure a lot of you know, Britain has been taking a lot of immigration, and statistically, the vast majority of British people don't want said immigration,
right.
But the British Uniparty does. And so the Conservatives won this huge victory in Britain, one of the largest in British history. And guess what? The Conservatives then imported in the most immigrants of any regime in British history by a significant margin.
Why?
Because Britain for its whole history has been run by this tiny aristocracy, this tiny elite. It used to be the nobility, then the rich, and now it's the managerial globalists. Okay. And I think they're partly crazy, and I can explain that if you like. I think they're partly crazy, and I also think that they also hate the British people, and they want to replace them. I think it's legitimately one of those things. They want a cheap labor force and a docile population so that they can. One of my friends says that the elites want to Mexicanize the Western world, where Mexico is a country where a small elite can do whatever they want, and most people are stuck in poverty. And massive regulations mean that the big companies can run everything because no one can compete.
Or the elite are basically in business with organized crime.
Exactly. And so you can see why an evil elite would want that, because it's inside their own self-interest. And they don't contextualize it in that way. But Mexico is a country where the elite could do whatever they wanted for centuries, and so it ends up in a similar place. And so I think...
You think they want that there?
So they claim to want the world... So look at the World Economic Forum is fascinating, and I think the elites want it here too. The World Economic Forum is fascinating because in itself, it's not a powerful organization, but it's a good weather vane for what powerful people do think, where like Biden... the guy who runs the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, he had a speech with Biden where he said China is a great model for the Western world. And so they just say stuff like that, or they say stuff like, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know the eat bugs, live in a pod, you'll own nothing. Yeah. This is stuff they say. And so the human mind is very good at rationalizing, and there's a wonderful book called The Elephant in the Brain, and it's a book about how humans rationalize bad things in a nice lens. And so people make up ideologies that rationalize whatever they want as a way to make it holy or good, where the Nazis wanted to genocide Eastern Europe, so that they made up an ideology where that was moral. The left wanted to kill the rich and take their stuff. They made an ideology where that's moral.